Welcome back to the technical forum on global risk assessments. Over the last 20 years, the practice of risk assessment has really grown by leaps and bounds. Yet, there are so many challenges. If we want to address systemic risk at the national or subnational level, we need to have a systemic understanding of risk. Without knowing what is the problem, what is the magnitude of the problem, what are the causative factors of the problem, how can we address those? And in that, there are many countries that are at a level where either data is not available or capacity is not available. So how do we come up with a way to sort of leapfrog in those countries and make the existing risk matrix available, the existing tools available, models available to help understand risk at that level? Today we have a stellar cast of colleagues from around the world who've been working on risk assessment issues for a very long time. The session will be moderated by Mr. Andrew Mascri. He is the coordinator of Risk Nexus Initiative, a close collaborator of CDRI. In fact, he is the coordinating lead author of the upcoming flagship report of the CDRI. I will turn over the floor to Andrew to moderate this session. Welcome, Andrew Mascri.
Okay, thank you very much, Kamal. Welcome to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you are. It's actually 5:30 a.m. for me, so if the sun comes up behind me and actually blinds the camera, I will move around. As Kamal said, this session is really about global risk and resilience of infrastructure. In the past, there have been other global assessments of physical assets, of buildings and the built environment. But infrastructure actually presents us with a different set of challenges, because to actually assess the global risk to infrastructure, we not only need to look at the physical assets at power stations, roads, telecommunications towers, and so on and so forth. We actually need to see how damage or loss of those assets would then actually affect the operation of infrastructure networks. So we need to move, in a sense, from a focus not just on assets, well, the assets continue to be important, but also onto the flows and the networks and the essential services which those assets provide. And I think this is a core challenge, because people don't actually depend on infrastructure per se for their lives and livelihoods. They actually depend on the essential services which infrastructure provides. So as part of the upcoming Global Flagship Report, which Kamal just mentioned, the idea is to do an update of what we already know about global risk, but really focusing in on some of the major infrastructure sectors, for example, power and energy, telecommunications, transport, and so on and so forth. But also then in a number of countries, hopefully not a few countries, quite a few countries, we're actually then going to drill down and really look at the resilience of infrastructure networks. So this session is going to just give a bit of an overview of some of the challenges we're going to be faced in assessing risk and resilience in global infrastructure. So we have an excellent group of speakers today. Let me just introduce some of them. We have from Ingenia in Colombia, Dr. Omar Darío Cardona and Dr. Gabriel Bernal. From the Cima Foundation in Italy, we have Dr. Roberto Rudari. From Geohazards International, we have Dr. Janice Rogers, who's the Chief Operating Officer. From the National Disaster Management Authority of the Maldives, we have its Deputy Chief Executive, Mr. Omar Fikri. From Santa Lucia in the Caribbean, we have Mr. Howard Wells, who's Director of the National Integrated Planning and Program Unit. And very much last but not least, from the University of Oxford, we have Professor Jim Hall, who's a Professor of Disaster and Climate Risk. So with no further ado, so we can get on promptly with this session, I'm going to ask the colleagues from Ingenia, Gabriel Benal and Omar Dario Cardona, to make a presentation on multi-hazard risk modeling for disaster risk and resilience assessment. So Gabriel, take us away, please.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, so hello to everyone who is attending. Thank you, Andrew, for the introduction. And the purpose of this presentation is to provide you an overview of what we're going to be dealing with, as Andrew said, for the multi-hazard probabilistic risk assessment of infrastructure at the global level. So next, please. As you can see, assessing risk to infrastructure is quite a challenge, and even more doing it at the global level. So if we want to provide any kind of useful and sensitive information about risk to the infrastructure, to the global infrastructure, we need to come up with some methodology, with some approach that is robust and sound enough so that we can say something meaningful about all the different sectors that compose the infrastructure portfolios of the countries in the world. Next. In this line, next please. Thank you. I'm sorry, my screen. Andrew, can you hear me?
Have you got an internet problem at your end, Gabriel? Can you hear us? He's frozen.
Hi, Andrew, can you hear me?
I can hear you now, so please continue.
Okay. Thank you. Yes. So I was saying that we start with some system model that has some specific domain and is composed by a network of interdependent assets. Through these assets, some service is rendered or some commodity is flowing, and all these elements are susceptible to damage once an hazard event occurs. So once the event occurs, we're going to be facing some direct loss due to the physical damage to the assets, but also some loss related to the unbalanced demand and offer conditions that are changing with respect to what was previously established before the event occurred. Now, this is a very complex problem that needs to be addressed gradually. Next, please. So basically, what we would have to do is to focus first on the physical damage, on the physical loss that is derived to the assets once the events occur. Next. So once we know the system and we are familiar with it and how it is confirmed, we need to evaluate the performance of the system to external disturbances, which are basically natural hazards. We're talking about earthquakes, tsunami, landslides, droughts, floods, tropical cyclones, among others. Next. And all these hazards need to be modeled using state-of-the-art physical models with an event-based approach. And this is key because we need to be able to quantify events, to simulate events of hazards so that after we simulate one event, we can quantify the extent of damage to the system and to its components and quantify all that as a direct physical loss. Next. So we need to define and we need to imagine all the possible ways in which hazard is going to be manifesting in the territory. This means multiple events of multiple hazards. This means thousands of possibilities that need to be simulated. because each event will imply a different disturbance to the system. Next, so moving from hazard to direct consequences implies applying physical probabilistic risk assessment. Next, please. At the end, what we get is a collection of events. Each event comes from a natural hazard event, but it's now expressed in terms of physical loss and some probability of occurrence. Of course, low disturbance events have higher probability of occurrence. Very high disturbance events have lower probability of occurrence, or in other words, they are less frequent. But at the end, we get a very high, very extensive collection of events that is making up for a fully probabilistic multi-hazard risk assessment. Now, in practical terms, it is quite unpractical to work with the full set, the full collection of these events. So we seek to condense everything into metrics. Next, please. So we're talking about risk curves. For example, the PML curve, which is a very used risk metric that relates return period to loss amounts, or point estimates, like, for example, the average annual loss, which basically is telling us all the, it's kind of condensing the whole risk process into a single number. And there are others that will be defined and will be complying with international standards and will be delivering all the information we need to assess risk at country level. Next, please. So in the short term, with this huge effort, what we hope to get is some physical risk metrics at country level. Maybe you can go to the next, please. You should be seeing a map. Thank you. So at each country, we hope to express, no, go back, please. To my screen froze, so I'm not following. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. What we're seeing here is what we hope to achieve in the short term. Some metrics, some expression of risk at the global level for each country that is telling us all the information we need in terms of disaster risk to the infrastructure portfolio of each country. So this means point estimates, this means curves, and risk profiles at the national level, as is illustrated here. Next, please. But we won't stop there, because we need to consider the effect that climate change is going to be implying to some of the hazards, particularly to hydrometeorological hazards. So for these hazards, we need to simulate the effect of climate change and to see how climate change is going to be modifying meteorological variables at the local level. We're going to be using the emission trajectories defined by IPCC, which are the representative concentration pathways that are more or less a very constrained and bounded way to define different pathways of greenhouse gases emissions. And these will have some effect at the local level. We downscale that information to some location we're working at, depending on the location of the infrastructure system. And then we can use more than 40 global circulation models with the 4 RCPs, and with several variations to the initial boundary conditions to come up with more than 300 projections of how the local weather will be changing in the future. So this is important because, as you see in the plot, this has 2 main features. It is dependent with time, but also it delineates some intervals at each moment in time. And this is key because the problem is so full of uncertainty. The uncertainty is so deep that the best we can do is to use those intervals, because it's very different to be in the lower bound of that interval than in the upper bound. The implications for weather and the implications for hydrometeorological hazards are completely different. So all these uncertainty is now incorporated into the model, next, so that all risk metrics now are become time dependent and imprecise. Take, for instance, this curve. This is an imprecise risk curve calculated for landslide risk to the highway system of Colombia, using 4 climate change projections up to 2055. And what you can see there is the deviations caused by the many possibilities of the way the future climate will develop around the green curve, which is the current condition without climate change. So we need to look into all these possibilities, all the range of possible variation, because actually the future climate will only be known in the future. So right now we don't know it, and we need to work with imprecise bounded interval conditions, interval metrics, so that we can express with full transparency what the disaster risk incorporating climate change will be to each infrastructure system. Next, please. So everything, all this I'm talking about will be computed with the Capra robot platform, which is a catastrophe risk modeling engine we at Ingenier have been working on for almost 20 years now. Next, please. We have been able to use it globally for many risk assessment projects and initiatives at the global level, at the regional, at the national, and at the local level. So we're very happy to use it now for this infrastructure risk assessment effort. Next, please. So to summarize, if we want to move from risk metrics to resilient infrastructure, first we need a multi-hazard risk profile that gives us information in terms of probabilistic risk metrics that incorporate climate change, that become time dependent and imprecise, and that allow us to define resilience targets, which basically are how much I want to reduce risk sometime in the future. Then we need to define some high resolution infrastructure risk model that incorporates both physical and operational domains of the infrastructure, and that allow us to stratify risk into different layers so that we can differentiate within those layers the possible actions to reduce risk. Next, please. And then we use this model to test all the different possibilities, applications, alternatives that could be developed and implemented for the system that allow us to achieve those resilience targets. Now, as you can see, next, please, this global risk model of the coalition of CDRI will focus only on the first box, which is already a lot, but it would provide the point of departure for this very important and exciting long-run process of achieving resilience. We are totally convinced that the path to disaster resilience starts at a good enough risk model. Next. Thank you for your kind attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Gabriel. That was excellent presentation, I think very, very clear. So I'm now going to pose a question to Dr. Omar Dario Cardona. So I'm just basically going to ask you, Omar, to reflect on Gabriel's presentation. I mean, according to your experience on working on previous global risk modeling efforts, what are the main features a global infrastructure risk model must have? So over to you, Omar. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, I think the main purpose of probabilistic risk modeling is to reveal latent disasters, more when most catastrophic events have not yet occurred. To decide, you have to measure, and at a global level, measuring with the same rule allows a ranking or to undertake a useful comparison among the countries that helps them to make risks explicit. A probabilistic and stochastic multi-hazard approach can invite the stakeholders and decision makers to ask themselves what each country can do to achieve a higher degree of resilience and improve their trade-offs between relevance and accuracy. Although a global model for assessing risks in infrastructure cannot include all variables, it can be good enough robust to inform the effect of uncertainty and invite to place the magnifying glass at the national level. Using the same arithmetic, one can take into account the non-stationary hazards, like the climate change related, the interdependence, and the impact on the continuity of floods and services. In summary, it is necessary to use probability to the extent possible. Do not oversimplify. Make decision makers appreciate the complexity and understand what is at stake, taking into account that decisions and actions are what really matters. Thank you, Andrew.
Sorry about everyone. So thanks, Omar Dario, an excellent compliment to Gabriel's presentation. So we're now going to change the focus for the next 10 or 15 minutes and look much more on what's happening in the world of the hydrometeorological hazards affected by climate change. And for this, I'm going to ask Dr. Roberto Rudari from the Cima Foundation in Savona, Italy, to please make us a presentation on hydrometeorological risk modeling, the climate risk and resilience assessment. So over to you, Roberto, please.
Thank you so much, Andrew. While I waited for the presentation is already here. I'm thanking already like a lot Gabriel and Omar Daria, for their own, for the introduction they gave us, because it will save me a lot of time, in explaining concepts related, to the probabilistic risk assessment. That, is I would say the key focus also of this presentation, although, we are focusing much more on the hydrometeorological part that has this very, I would say, nice aspects or nice flavor that of the necessity of assessing not only, I would say, the present conditions, but also how these might vary like in the future. Taking into account also the climate change part. So next, please. And next again. So actually, I wanted to drive your attention to some of the key questions that I was posing myself when we started reasoning about this framework, and it's and especially when we were trying to think about this portion of hazards that are named, let's say, hydrometeorological. So, for example, on the floods and drought side, that are, let's say, two, let's say, coins of the same metal, let's say. So, it would be, important to connect them properly through, like, generating, a proper, set of events, as it was previously said by Gabriel, that are consistent one another, because we cannot, reason in silos. if we want to really perform like a risk assessment that is really multi-hazard in essence. And this is very important when we face, for example, the challenge of computing risk related to floods and droughts in a consistent manner. The second point is that the fact of resolution. We are facing like a global challenge, and we would like, to be more as accurate as precise as possible. But there are limitations, and we need to find like a balance between, the resolution and let's say the reliability of, our results in the end. And here I would say that given that many times, critical assets are point locations, like, we were mentioning, for example, energy plants, and or like in single points in a network. These, of course, enhances the need, for, let's say, having a very good resolution also on the hazard side of it when we are mixing everything, into the risk assessment computations. And also, from my point of view, it's really, necessary for us, to understand, according to each hazard category, what are, to identify what are the most vulnerable critical assets, to the different, specific hazards, because, these might change very much, when we are considering, I don't know, cyclones on one side, or earthquakes, or floods, or droughts, certainly, we will see, some examples of that. Other key questions were, how we can reflect, the impacts on the critical infrastructures as well. This last point was, mentioned already by Andrew in the introduction. We cannot just, assess only, I would say, the point of having a single, let's say, assessment of the physical damage, for example, to the point, but we needed to understand, all the implication that this has, in the framework of a critical resilient infrastructure, absolutely. And then the last point, it was, very well, actually assessed, and also in Gabriel's presentation already, how we consistently, assess climate change. How do we, quantify this in a highly uncertain condition, of course, because, of course, as it was already said, we only know how the climate, will change when we will experience that. But, we can certainly make some prediction, but those predictions are affected by uncertainty. And there were, so many others that I'm skipping here, but just to give you an idea of the, the very profound challenges that we are trying to face, from the scientific point of view here. Next, please. Here is just, like a small sketch of how, for example, the probabilistic modeling framework could, work for floods. Just to give you an idea of how complex could be, the cascading effect of that needs to be considered when, we go, from, let's say, the global circulation models down, to the point where we are trying to assess how this, is affecting a single point in a specific place in a specific country. And it's not that I would like, to analyze, this specifically, but this was just, to show, the complexity that is behind, this type of modelization, and the possibility that, in fact, the probabilistic modeling framework is giving us, because anytime we have like a model, that is serving like some outputs, inputs to another model, we are creating a certain level of uncertainty, and the probabilistic modeling framework allows us to take, explicitly into account this uncertainty and factor this into our risk computation. So if you next, if you can hit it, so we can, address, the primary aleatory uncertainty, in our first part of the game, but also if you can click again, we can have a second, next. A second, source of uncertainty that can be factored in, when we are trying, in the end to assess also the epistemic one. So the uncertainty that is related to our inability to mimic, perfectly, all the different conditions. And similarly, if you can go to the next one, we can do the same thing for drought. This type of things, gets, complicated enough, I would say, because of different ways you see, how different could be, the modeling framework in the case of one hazard as compared to the other, and this needs to be, taken into account when we are considering, I would say, the multi-hazard aspect of this type of study. It's lucky that we have already like a very good knowledge of how this project should be handled, and how this modeling effort should be handled by previous experience. But it's a challenge per se. A point, a very important point, very strong important point here is that you see, in the upper part of this sketch, as compared to the one that I was showing you before, there is like the same engine that is actually moving the things. In the case of the hydrological, hydrometeorological type of hazards. So you can next, please. So we can say that we have a common modeling engine there. So we have like a weather generator, so-called, that allows us, to address, for example, floods on one side and droughts on the other, but link them consistently, because we will have like a common weather generator that is giving us, all the statistical essence in compliance between, the two types of extremes. In this case, so we will be able not only to address, the flood risk on one side and the drought risk on the other side, but also a combination of those. And in fact, we will have the ability of, consider also like, a sequence of floods and drought that could be, affecting very strongly a system and a critical infrastructure system. So, next. A strong emphasis, I would like to put is on the effort, to basically constrain, I mean, all these modeling framework as much as possible on observation. So, I mean, for example, in the case of, models, I mean, to be used to feed, the full modeling chain, such as, regional climate models, for example, global and regional climate models, the bias correction part, I mean, done on observation would be, I mean, very, very important. You see here an example for India, for example, on how, bias correction could affect, the final results. You see, the blue line is an unbiased, let's say, uncorrected, let's say, prediction from, the meteorological models, while, the green one is in fact the bias corrected one. And this is also, I mean, super important when we do our consideration for, the climate change, I mean, so for the future years, I mean, to come. Next. Of course, critical infrastructure could be, points, and I mean, we need to be able to address, I mean, the same targets, I mean, to, different hazard conditions. Here, for example, I mean, I was putting into a map, I mean, some, critical assets like dams and hydrological hydropower plants, I mean, that to be affected by droughts on one side, but next, I mean, they could be, next please, I mean, they could be affected also by floods, I mean, in very many different ways. I mean, so we have, the same, critical assets that could be, actually combinedly affected and compoundedly affected by different conditions. Go on. And next one, just, I mean, to show you, like, I mean, the results of a probabilistic risk assessment, as it was shown already, like in the sketch from Gabriel. I mean, here we can have, like, I mean, some average annual loss, I mean, computations, I mean, on different sectors, including, the most, I mean, important from, let's say, the critical construction point of view, like, for example, productive assets. And certainly, I mean, we can go on and, deliver another metrics, like, for example, I mean, if you can go on next, PML curves, I mean, of a certain type of sector. Next slide, please. Okay, so such in this case. So if you can go on next, my last point that I would like to make, next one. We can have the same assessment for, let's say, agricultural drought. I mean, of course, in this case, for example, the productive assets, I mean, are impacted in a very different way. In this case is like really the essence of, the critical infrastructure part, because, for example, here we have some estimates in this specific case of, how hydropower production could be affected by drought, for example. So what would be the loss, I mean, in production, I mean, in this condition. And next, please, I mean, we can have, an estimate also, I mean, in terms of the probable maximum loss. Next. Of the probable maximum loss on the productive assets. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay. In this case, also, I mean, in terms of, the different frequencies and return periods in current climate and projected climate. So this type of metrics can be really derived also from the point of view of, let's say, the critical infrastructure, also in terms of production in this case, which is not just, connected with the direct losses. Next one. And we'll leave, I mean, with you with some conclusions and some reflections, and which are certainly that's, hydromet hazards, but in general, whole our multi-hazard effort cannot be analyzed in silos. So we need, I mean, to reason in a common, let's say, modeling framework. And I mean, to the probabilistic risk assessment, we will be producing a rigorous quantification of risk. I mean, for example, in several sectors, I mean, connected to critical infrastructure. And the metrics derived from, probabilistic risk assessment can be effectively used in decision-making processes. There are challenges on the right-hand side of these slides, which is absolutely, I mean, the ones that were already highlighted by other speakers, while, I mean, we need, I mean, to address, I mean, and start from the direct impacts. The indirect impacts are, the dominant factor, I mean, for this, let's say, modeling framework. And it's a challenge sometimes, I mean, to understand, the analyzed system, I mean, in order to quantify those. While floods, I mean, for example, in this case, have a direct impact on, let's say, critical infrastructure by, causing direct damage. I mean, in the case of drought, indirect damage are, the sole sometimes, sole part, to be quantified, as I was explaining, for example, in the case of hydropower. And in this case, while there are some consolidated methodologies for, let's say, analyzing impact on critical infrastructure on a local scale, I think that we are called, to have a sort of, to do a very good brainstorming exercise to quantify this at global scale. As Omar Dario was saying before, we need to find a good balance between, what we can represent and what we cannot represent, though, capturing the essential points, in our modeling framework at global scale. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Roberto. So I've just got one question for you for the next couple of minutes, and this is really on the issue of hydrological drought. Hydrological drought's one of the hazards we're going to look at globally in this assessment, but it's an interesting hazard because it doesn't actually affect physical assets, but it really does affect the systems and essential services which those assets provide, because we know that hydrological drought can affect cooling water for power stations, it can affect drinking water systems, it can affect river transport, etc. So how do we actually assess hydrological drought risk if physical exposure data is perhaps not as useful as in the case of other hazards? What has been CIMA's experience in assessing hydrological drought?
Yeah, as I was, trying, to explain before, in the case of hydrological drought, as you're saying, direct impact is not the case. We need already to model to do this kind of jump. In modeling already, the effect on the system per se. I was showing the case of hydropower production, and certainly, addressing, for example, what, is lost in production just because, the drought conditions are not allowing, the storages at being, at the right specific level to be exploited at their maximum expectations. That is one of the points, but certainly, this is the case of, as you're saying, of essential services like, access to potable water. And this, it reflects is not only droughts, I would say, for potable waters, of course, pollution, that comes, from floods, it's also, hampering that essential function as well. Here we are basically called, to the challenge of understanding as much as possible, how the system, what are, the key points that, the system, is really, where the system is really weak, and we need to address, what would be the impact, those parts. Quantification then, comes along, very nicely, because we are always able, once we understood, the process chain, I would say, to identify, the factors for quantification, especially in a probabilistic risk framework, as the one that we are trying to apply. Thank you, Andrew.
Roberto, great. Very nice presentation and very nice answer to the question. So we're now going to move on to our panel discussion. I've already mentioned who are our four panelists. So I'm going to ask a question to each one of the four panelists in turn. Each panelist will have 5 minutes, so you can both answer the question, but also if you'd like to contribute any additional reflections on the presentations you've heard, that would be great as well. So we're going to start off with Dr. Janice Rogers from Geohazards International. Janice, you were involved in Geohazards International's work in developing disaster scenarios in the Indian city of Aizawl, as well as several districts of Nepal since 2013. From your experience, how does scenario development help in assessing the vulnerability of systems?
Thank you, Mr. Mascray. I first want to say that scenarios are primarily a risk communication tool, as well as, and their development is a process that allows us to involve people with the goal of motivating action to build resilience before disasters strike. So that's the context in which I'll be speaking. So scenario development does provide us a couple of important opportunities that are very helpful to us when we are assessing vulnerabilities, though. And the first is engaging people who manage and operate infrastructure systems and who really understand how they work. We found that it's very important to understand how the systems work in order to understand how hazard events may affect them. So we do a lot of talking to people, as well as, of course, field observations to try to understand potential vulnerabilities and preparedness deficits, to understand what might happen during a hazard event like an earthquake. And then, of course, what can be done to build resilience, because that's really our end goal. Involving people also helps us to understand the context better, why the system is the way it is, plus that intangible institutional memory and the things that probably aren't written down anywhere. And involving people from the beginning really pays tremendous dividends, just in terms of their willingness to participate in the entire scenario process, to understand and to believe the results, which unfortunately in many cases are going to show some resilience challenges that need overcoming. And then, of course, to be a part of the subsequent resilience building work. That's the main goal. And so the second opportunity that scenarios provide us with is the ability to describe in qualitative form, maybe using a narrative or a timeline, the impacts that are not easily modeled or simulated, but are very important. Interdependencies between infrastructure systems and cascading impacts of damage are just prime examples. So to use the example of Aizal in Mizoram that you mentioned, if there were to be a major earthquake, which we hope that there's not a major earthquake anytime soon, the water system there would not only have to contend with the damage, so the people that manage the system would have to look at the damage to their own system in order to restore the services that are essential for the city, but also damage to the power system that runs the pumps that pump water up from the river, which is down here, and the city is up on a ridge top. And those pumps have generators that run them, but they rely on diesel that has to be delivered by truck to run the pumps for very long. Obviously, there's only so much fuel storage at the pump house. And landslides and debris from collapsed buildings are likely to block roads and streets. The landslide hazard in Aizal is very high, so we expect a lot of landslides if there were to be an earthquake. And clearing streets might not happen immediately because search and rescue efforts will be ongoing. Imagine if someone's trapped in a building, then the search and rescue will need to complete, and they'll need to rescue the person before they can clear the street or the road. So the blocked roads would also, of course, impede the efforts to repair the different infrastructure systems, water, power, or to do things like provide water in tanker trucks. So all of this would be really complicated to try and model, but we can get a good conceptual sense of the problems just through some description. And this allows agencies to plan and to also better understand what they may have to contend with in terms of loss of service from other infrastructure systems. So scenarios allow us to do both these things, to really involve people and then to describe disaster impacts that are not easily modeled. And this helps with our overall goal of building resilience. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. That was the end. You finished. Yeah, okay, great. In that case, we're going to go on to the next panelist. This is Mr. Omar Fikri from the Maldives. Mr. Fikri, Maldives conducted a detailed national level risk assessment back in 2007. Could you tell us what have been some of the key learnings from the process? And particularly, I think we'd be interested to know how the risk assessment has been used in decision-making in the Maldives since it was done. So over to you, Mr. Fikri, please.
Thank you, Andrew. I get that you hear me well.
We can hear you very well.
Yeah. I think the first two presentations was excellent, so thank you for those as well. In the Maldives, as you mentioned, we have undertaken detailed island risk assessments of 10 of the islands. I'll give a bit of, I'll very quickly give a bit of the history behind our journey to do risk assessments. Before the tsunami, we did not consider disaster risks. So the tsunami was more of an eye-opener for the Maldives to ensure that for us to move forward, for us to achieve the sort of development and take the country to the next level, we need to incorporate disaster risk management measures into national development planning. Before the tsunami, as you would all know, the Maldives is a very low-lying island. We have 1,000 small islands where 200 are inhabited islands where people are living. And we knew, and the government knew that for us to really move on with development, we wouldn't really have the necessary resources to develop all the islands at an equitable level. So there was this policy of population consolidation where people would be moved into urban centers, population centers where basic services would be developed. But the tsunami changed all that. We knew that population consolidation is also not is not a complete solution, and if we are to develop urban centers, we would need to consider all forms of risk. And for us to be informed on that, the government initiated undertaking risk assessments of what we call then Safer Island projects. The Safer Island project had a huge assumption. The assumption was that all islands could be made safe with proper engineering measures. And based on that, the detailed island risk assessments was conducted. So how can we make our island safer for future hazards and scenarios? The risk assessments that was undertaken, I would say, supports this notion that we can create safer islands, but also challenges the idea and the designs that were proposed. It concludes four recommendations that very well captures how the idea of safer islands and how risk assessments could be utilized for future development planning. So these four recommendations or findings of the detailed island risk assessments that we undertook are that the number one is that no island in the Maldives is safe. The report suggests that each island has a maximum threshold level, especially for flooding events. When the threshold level is met, the entire island could be flooded, and it doesn't matter the existing geophysical characteristics of the island. The second finding is that all islands are generally exposed to natural hazards, but some islands are comparatively less exposed due to geophysical setup of the island. So in light of these two findings, the report suggests that we may be able to find possible measures to control the impact of hazards for existing events using engineering solutions. But however, the suitability of adopted solutions is questioned when we take slow onset hazards such as climate change. So the report suggests that safer islands cannot be developed based on a preset design or a template, and we would need to constantly undertake risk assessments to find the best engineering solution. In light of this report, the government also undertook cost-benefit analysis of three of the mitigation measures proposed to the three of the islands for three of the islands that was being developed. The cost-benefit analysis at the end of the day summarized that again investments needs to be thought out well, because there are significant levels of uncertainty because of the ratios are not consistently positive. It also recommended that we would need to have a significant shift towards softer measures of protection to increase resilience at the island level. And it also proposed that we would need to limit human activities to limit the damage to natural environment, which is the biggest defense system of the Maldives. Based on these recommendations, we have modified the designs of these islands, and 3 of these islands had incorporated the design elements that was modified after the DRAM process. Yeah, thank you. That's it from me.
Okay, thank you very much, Omar. That's a great presentation. We're now going to move from the Indian Ocean over to the Caribbean. So we have Howard Wells now from Santa Lucia, who's going to be joining us on the panel. Howard, you were the lead coordinator for the National Infrastructure Assessment exercise in Santa Lucia, which was jointly undertaken with UNOPS and the University of Oxford. Can you tell us a little bit about this exercise and how it's informed Santa Lucia's investment decisions in the years that have followed? So over to you, Howard.
Thank you, and good day to the panelists. Excellent discussions thus far. It is indeed a wonderful opportunity to allow St. Lucia, a small island state in the Caribbean, to be part of such discussions. We were indeed privileged, Andrew, to have been selected amongst the many territories of the Caribbean to participate in what we considered a very useful evidence-based infrastructure assessment exercise. So what really was the exercise? It started back in 2019. However, the actual document, the actual findings was launched in 2020, owing to, of course, logistics concerns with the COVID, as well as the Prime Minister's office being interested in the launch. So that made it a bit difficult in terms of getting a good timing. So what really was the assessment? So St. Lucia had this report done. It was essentially a vision for the future of infrastructure planning for the island. And that vision was aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals 2030, as well as the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. So the National Infrastructure Assessment comprised really of 2 major components. One of those was a long-term strategic infrastructure plan, and the second being an adaptation planning component. That assessment considered the likely outcomes for the performance of infrastructure sectors in St. Lucia on the 3 key strategies. One being inaction, which simply means us doing nothing. The second being business as usual. So continuing to develop infrastructure just as we've done with very limited cross-sectoral analysis, etc. And the third scenario being, of course, the use or the implementation of a national infrastructure strategy. As would be the case for most vulnerable island states with limited land resources, limited space, and economic challenges, the planning of infrastructure systems, it's key, it's vital. You can only get it right once. So this became even more acute for St. Lucia as we saw enormous growth within our main economic sectors, namely agriculture and tourism. So through extensive data collection, cross-sectoral analysis of our future infrastructure needs were estimated. And we looked at several sectors. However, the report zoned in on 4 of those, which were really the areas that we were able to capture most data given the time frame. So we looked at the energy sector, we looked at the potable water sector, we looked at the wastewater sector, and we also considered the solid waste sector for the island. Recommendations were made on the needs and a series of projects, policies, and investments were spelled out in that study. But the key thing was that those investments were aligned with broader strategic policies of the island, and of course, other international conventions to which St. Lucia had already signed on to. Additionally, we looked at climate change-driven hazards posing risks to economic infrastructure in St. Lucia, to coastal infrastructure, as well as our natural environmental assets. The purpose of this really was to have prioritized necessary actions to deal with the impacts of those likely hazards. So the impacts that we considered were what in my view, were 4 relevant climate hazard risks, namely sea level rise, storm surge, flash flooding, and landslides. We looked at scenarios, for instance, a 1 meter sea level rise and a 4 meter storm surge. When the assessment was completed, a 4 meter storm surge would have been considered very unusual. However, we saw last year in the Bahamas what the impacts of a 5 meter storm surge was on the island. And this modeling identified some very revealing and frightening things to us. We recognize, for instance, that 80% of the island's major economic infrastructural assets would have been impacted by one or more of those hazards. For instance, I can give the example. Our National Land Registry is strategically located on the ground floor of a building, considering access to persons of all abilities, the high volume of traffic, etc. However, it is on a waterfront. So what does that mean? In the event of the likelihood of a 4 meter or even a 1 meter sea level rise, there is the strong possibility of losing all of such vital economic information, such vital records. But the good thing about the study, it propelled the government to have taken action immediately. So the digitization of our land registry is happening and it's at an advanced stage. So this again provided new and important evidence to support infrastructure decision-making to ensure long-term sustainability and resilience and the development as we develop the island. Finally, Andrew, to respond to the investment component of the question, unfortunately, no sooner than the report was completed, it was taken to our cabinet. We had to grapple with the ravages of COVID, which is still impacting the world. However, there were some investments within 2 of the sectors that I mentioned previously. So there were investments in the solid waste sector, as well as the potable water sector. Albeit, those were projects that were already in train. So they did not start post the National Infrastructure Assessment. However, we did get the opportunity to have shared and consulted with those entities. So they did make changes where possible to have responded to some of the recommendations. We do now have a good opportunity. There are 2 major ongoing projects that are being guided very strongly by the National Infrastructure Assessment, and that is very key. The Blackwater treatment issue in our main capital city, as well as the treatment, the ongoing project, looking at non-revenue water loss throughout our national grid. So those 2 systems have been supported by the National Infrastructure Assessment. That in a nutshell is my response to your question. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Howard. Great presentation. Thanks very much. Sun has now come up in Costa Rica, so blessings to everyone. We're now going to move on to Professor Jim Hall, who's just joined us. He was actually stuck in a parliamentary committee, but I understand he's already now joined the panel. So welcome, Jim. The question to you we have is, the systems analysis methods carried out by your team in Oxford have been applied now in a number of countries. We've just heard about Santa Lucia, but they've also been applied in Argentina, Curacao, Ghana, and other places. So in your experience, is the conventional method of risk engineering using exposure data enough to evaluate the resilience of infrastructure systems in countries? What other methodologies should be used to measure the resilience of infrastructure assets as well as systems? Over to you, Jim.
Thanks very much indeed, Andrew. Yes, no, apologies for the delay in joining you. Actually, it was a Parliament inquiry into risk and resilience that I was appearing before, so very relevant to this conference. Risk engineering and quantified risk analysis is something I'm very enthusiastic about, as are a number of other people you've heard on this panel. Why? Because quantified evidence provides information that's needed to prioritize actions to enhance resilience. Most of those actions are not for free, so we need to be very rigorous in terms of the way in which we prioritize and make the business case for them. It helps to expose what the natural hazard, natural disaster risks to infrastructure investments might be. And there's an increasing demand for reporting on climate-related risks through initiatives like the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. So we need to know, and in fact, we need to quantify in financial terms how big disaster risk might be. That type of information is needed in the insurance sector for disaster risk finance, and it's increasingly needed in terms of financial regulation, for example, in terms of sovereign finances and fiscal stability, where we have countries like those small island states that we've already heard from, where the occurrence of natural disasters, hurricanes, represent a tremendous economic and financial shock to a government. So we need to quantify what the scale of those shocks might be. And fortunately, there's been great progress in terms of our capacity to do that type of risk quantification, which has been led by the insurance industry, which has become more or less completely model-based, having in the last century been based on empirical evidence and what happened in the past. But there are still significant gaps, which I think is where the chair's question is pointing to. And where we are conventionally now in terms of quantified natural disaster risk analysis is looking at hazard, asset exposure, vulnerability in terms of the sensitivity of those assets. But we use layers of assets as points on a map. You might think about them sets of points, and we quantify the risk across that map. But what if we're thinking about infrastructure? We really need to understand is the way in which those assets operate together as systems in order to deliver services to people and the economy and society. And so this is where a lot of the research within my group is located, is looking at flows on power networks, on water networks, in transport networks, the ways in which they might be disrupted by natural disasters, the capacity to reroute for the existence of stores or stocks in the system, which mean that there are some buffers to the effect of those hazards, and then the capacity to repair and recover. So in that sense, that it is one of the gaps that's in the process of being filled at increasingly large scales, so up to global scales. Some research which my group contributed to for the World Bank's Lifelines report on infrastructure resilience looked at 60 million kilometers of transport network data across the globe. And there's work actually just coming out either today or tomorrow from my group looking at entire global shipping networks. So 1,400 ports around the world and the extent to which they operate as networks. Ships go between all of these ports. We can use real-time ship tracking data and work out what the effect of disasters on those networks are. The other point I would make, however, is that all of this modeling is fantastic and we love it, but there are some things which are really important, which are not well represented in models, and this is more to do with the human and institutional aspects of risk. What are the regulations in a country? For example, with respect to protection standards, how rigorously are those regulations enforced? How much capacity is there within institutions to step in an emergency, cope? How much backup capacity they have, how quickly, and how much human and resources do people have in terms of being able to repair and recover, because we know it's the duration of disruption is so critical in terms of the whole economic impact. So we're beginning to explore these questions. We're in the process of interacting with CDRI now in terms of where we take those things. Too soon to make an announcement, but very exciting where this analysis is going. And basically it's going towards a global capability to assess infrastructure network risks, a global platform, which means that one can take default global data sets and use them as the starting point for a deeper dive in any particular country, where you're starting to ask these really crucial questions around where do we start, how much resource should we allocate, what are the priorities?
Great. Sorry, thank you very much, Jim. Excellent presentation. I'm just looking at the time. I think we have exactly 2 minutes to address questions from the audience, which is not a particularly long amount of time. So I'm just I've got 3 or 4 questions I can choose from. I'm just gonna choose one. And I'm actually going to ask Roberto if you can maybe reflect on that question. So an interesting question is that obviously you've talked about modeling hydrometeorological hazards, but the question here is that the weather and indeed the climate obviously don't respect national boundaries. So how would we deal in a modeling framework with events in one country, severe flooding, cloudbursts, avalanches, etc., where the effects are actually in a neighboring state? Over to you, Roberto. You just have literally 1 minute, and then we're going to have to wrap up the session.
That is a very difficult question, Andrew. Indeed, I mean, I would say from the modeling point of view, that the administrative boundary do not count. Okay, so what we are going to do, I mean, in terms of modeling, and we are doing this also on the national scale. I mean, and even more so, I mean, where we are facing, regional tasks or global tasks. I mean, our modeling unit is a modeling unit that, I mean, follows more, how the hazard unfolds. Okay, so to be, I mean, trivial, I mean, I would say in the case of floods or riverine flood is we model the catchment. We do not model just, a segment that, I mean, goes in one country or the other. And this is certainly taken into account. While, I mean, I would say a lot of challenge, while, we use administrative boundaries mainly, I would say, to, let's say, aggregate risk. Okay, because I mean, when we are trying to develop, the metrics like AEL or PMLs. I mean, we need like a spatial unit. I mean, to aggregate. I mean, those points and compute those metrics. However, I see like I do see like a very strong challenge. I mean, if we have like an interconnection, transboundary interconnection, not only on the hazard side but also on the from the point of view of the critical resilience infrastructure. For example, many times, and I would say effects in one country or direct damage in one country do have an effect. In another one, we were experiencing, a very, similar thing. Here in Italy, and not later than 5 years ago, where there was like a shutting down of the Swiss, power plant because of some reason, and of course, strong, problems, from let's say the offer side, appears, into the Italian market. Of course, we would need, to analyze not only the hazard, as a system that has no boundary, but in this case also, the networks and the critical infrastructure as, a complex system that, do not, go on the boundary side. Certainly, this is a challenge, but it's something that we can certainly, we experience, the modelers around the table, we can face, in fact.
Thank you very much, Roberto. We have, 3 or 4 other questions on queue, but we don't actually have any time now to address them. So I'm just going to finalize the session by again really thanking all our presenters and panelists. So Gabriel, Omar Dario coming in from Colombia, Roberto from Italy, Omar from the Maldives, Janice, I'm not really sure where you're coming in from, but I guess from somewhere, California maybe. We've got Jim coming in from Oxford, and last but not least, Howard joining us from Santa Lucia in the Caribbean. So thanks very much to all of you for your contributions, and thanks to the CDRI and India for providing this space for this discussion and this debate. Thank you very much. We'll finish here.
That excellent session, which went into depth of various aspects of conducting risk assessments, advancements that have been made in the last several years, some of the methodological challenges, the whole notion of how do we use scenarios as communication tools, and the 2 cases from 2 small island developing nations. The Maldives example of how you can actually use risk assessments to make specific decisions. How do you prioritize different islands? How do you choose safe islands? How do you define hard measures, soft measures for building resilience? And St. Lucia was absolutely fascinating, really on the cutting edge of applications of risk assessment. I think the example that was given on how you can actually use risk assessment to do a strategic planning for infrastructure development in the country, as well as identifying hotspots in the country. The example of national registry being right in the way of risk if there was a big storm surge in a changed climate scenario when the sea level would have risen. So that was really fascinating. Many of you, in fact, almost all of you are collaborators of CDRI. We have an ambitious work agenda ahead of us, working together over the coming couple of years in taking this work forward at the global level, as well as doing deep dive in a few countries. With that, I thank you all. We'll swiftly move on to the next session, which is a high-level policy session. But before that, we'll take a 1-minute break to do sound checks, etc. And we'll be right back with you in 90 seconds. Thank you very much.